Well, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me here today. And I am going to try very hard to stick to the time limits, so perhaps this will have a certain breathless quality to it. Just first off, I do want to put in a plug for my book, Race, Wrongs, and Remedies, and many of the themes I'll be discussing here will come out of that book. Really, my interest in this subject arose from my experience teaching poverty law. I teach about poverty, deprivation, and inequality, and of course, race inevitably comes up. And immediately I noticed a kind of exasperating, disconcerting sameness, a kind of stale, formalistic, ritualistic approach to the topic of race. And I determined to, in effect, try to build a better mousetrap, break through some of the usual shibboleths here. One point that was especially sore in discussions of race, I thought, was this accusation of blaming the victim. Whenever someone pointed out the limits of government programs or policies or services and sought to stress the importance of self-actualization or self-help, the victim-blaming accusation would be trotted out to effectively stop the conversation. I really think that this is quite pernicious, and I think it's wrong-headed. And my insight comes in part out of my experience teaching another subject, which is remedies. Now, there's a very strong ideal in remedies law, which is that the wrongdoer, the person who causes the harm, has to fix the harm. That's our ideal of justice. And it's an important one. But remedies also recognizes that that ideal cannot always be realized. To make a long story short, I think that the situation of Black America today is a situation where the ideal of justice can no longer be realized. The wrongdoer cannot fix what's broken, and here I'm talking about white society, the rest of us, those of us who have undeniably harmed Black America through discrimination, persecution, slavery, and the like. No, I think we're at the point where only the victim can cure himself. I have a trope in my book called The Parable of the Pedestrian, where I try to illustrate this insight. Just very briefly, a pedestrian is run over by a truck driver. He injures his spine. He has to go to a rehab center, and the truck driver and his company pay for his stay at the rehab center, which is kind of a middling rehab center, but good enough. And the therapist there says to the pedestrian, unless you make a huge, sustained, strong, painful effort to walk again, you never will. The pedestrian says, that's not fair. The truck driver has to make me walk again. He's the one who harmed me. But that's impossible, said the therapist. It just doesn't work that way. And I think today for Black Americans, we can say the same. No longer can white society rescue Black America. No longer can white society fix what's wrong, fix what's broken. So what is wrong? What's broken? I think that centuries of persecution have generated patterns of behavior, practices, habits, belief, and patterns of thinking among the Black community that are, frankly, dysfunctional. And I'll go beyond that and say that in my view, based on the data that I have seen, and I summarize in my book, those patterns are far, far more important than discrimination presently. Not past discrimination, but present discrimination. And I am not saying that discrimination does not exist. I am saying that discrimination is now a small part of what is holding Blacks back. So concretely, where are these dysfunctions? Three main areas, and we've already talked about these today, and I'm going to say just a little bit more about them. First, family structure, sexual and reproductive behavior. Second, educational underachievement, and then lagging performance on the job. And third, criminality and breaking the law. Family structure. Now, we've already heard a lot about this. The usual story on the street and in academia is that the breakdown of the family is an inevitable outgrowth of the current economic climate, right? The disappearance of working-class jobs. We have to move the economy. We have to remediate this by changing economic conditions, and that is the only path to reweaving the family. I suggest that when we look at the data, that just doesn't pass the smell test. We can look cross-sectionally and we can look longitudinally. Cross-sectionally, we can control for income, education, whether a man holds a job or not, and if we look cross-ethnic groups, we see that blacks marry at far lower rates up and down the socioeconomic scale. Well-educated blacks marry at much lower rates than well-educated whites, Hispanics, Asians. Less educated blacks marry at much lower rates. This is not economics, folks. This is behavior. This is culture. Look back over time, right? Harry Holzer makes out like every working class man had a great job 50, 60, 70 years ago. I know for a fact that's not true. People of very modest income and prospects, right, half a decade ago or more, were married at much, much higher rates in all ethnic groups. Having modest economic prospects does not inevitably lead to the breakdown of the family. Indeed, quite the opposite. Today and in the past, when people who have less education and have working class jobs join forces and marry and get together and stick together, they improve their economic prospects, right? And people like Robert Lerman at the Urban Institute have shown this statistically to be the case. What about educational underachievement and lagging on the job? Well, the black-white test score gap and performance gap is very well known today, and it's been amply documented. But here's an important insight, right? The black-white achievement gap doesn't stop at the schoolhouse door. It translates over into job performance, right? And that has consequences for how much people earn and their advancement on the job. Now, if you look at the industrial psychology literature, as I have recently had occasion to do, here's an unpleasant fact. Blacks lag in job performance on both objective and subjective measures by about half a standard deviation across most jobs, even if they have the same number of years of education. Now, why is that? Because years of education don't tell the whole story. You have to control for other indicia of human capital, which is how much the person has achieved, what their aptitude is, what their test scores are, what they've learned in school. And we know that there are racial gaps in what people learn in school and the human capital that they bring into school, even the same schools. Okay? We cannot account for this by saying that blacks go to worse schools, although on average they might, because this achievement gap exists within the same schools. Okay? And it exists among affluent blacks and less affluent blacks. Indeed, affluent blacks have the biggest gap relative to affluent whites at any income level than less well-off blacks. Okay? So there's something going on here that I think just economics and quality of schools and externals cannot account for, and I call that outlook, attitudes, culture. Now, I submit that the government can do virtually nothing to change these things, that this is not something that the government can affect. Okay, she's saying end here, so let me just end up with one point. There is a world of difference between helping people who are less well off and utterly transforming their behavior. We have an outsized faith now in social engineering, in changing the fundamental way that people are through government, through programs, through services. This cannot be done. I know that it's churlish to dump on the Harlem's Children's Program, which is a wonderful program, right? The Harlem Children's Zone, I guess it's called. But what are we trying to do here? What we're trying to do is impossible. Basically, we have a crash program to turn children into constructive citizens that entirely replaces the family and says we need to rebuild children from the bottom up because the traditional structures and institutions that are doing it are failing us. And I say that's impossible, right? No institution can come in and do what these traditional structures have failed to do. Right? We cannot find enough warm bodies, enough dedicated people to enter our lives and transform individuals ab ovo, right, and replace the family. Thank you.